Fortunately for me, the request for a lecture on disability studies in America in the 21st century comes at a perfect time. I was recently asked to write an essay about the book Narrative Prosthesis: Disability and the Dependencies of Discourse by David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder. That book was published in 2000 at the dawn of the new century. The book remains highly influential after 25 years, and I'll explain why. But for now, I'll begin by talking about the intellectual context in which it appeared. Disability studies in the United States, in the humanities, began to emerge in the mid to late 1990s. In 1995, I was aware of the publication of Leonard Davis's book, Enforcing Normalcy. And the following year, I had on my desk the page proofs of Rosemary Garland Thompson's Freakery: Cultural Spectacles of the Extraordinary Body, which was eventually published in October 1996. But even though I was writing my book about Jamie, my son with Down syndrome, during this period, that would be Life as We Know It, a father, a family, and an exceptional child, I didn't think of my book as an example of new work in disability studies. Now, in retrospect, Life as We Know It seems to have been one of the early works in the field, but there wasn't enough critical mass of work at the time for me to think of my own book that way. What stands out to many younger scholars in the field today are the manifest limitations of the field in its infancy, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But at the time, many of us experienced the early work in the field as a long-awaited breakthrough. Already established scholars, like Leonard Davis or Tobin Siebers, retooled their careers completely. And people like Simi Linton, Rosemary Garland Thompson, and Brenda Bergman, as well as Mitchell and Snyder, forged a feminist disability studies in the humanities distinct from the earlier work of Adrienne Ash and Michelle Fine in the social sciences. That sense of breakthrough was not illusory. I remember reading Tobin Siebers' essay, Disability in Theory, From Social Constructionism to the New Realism of the Body, in manuscript when it was a submission to the journal PMLA, Publications of the Modern Language Association, where it was turned down because another reader decided it didn't have anything to do with literature. I was the third reader, tasked with adjudicating the first two readers' reports, one positive, one negative, and I was strongly supportive, but PMLA receives so many submissions that one bad reader's report is usually enough to kill an article. American Literary History, a different journal, with a more capacious editorial policy, published Tobin Siebers' essay 2 years later. But the initial resistance to disability studies in some quarters was quite real. In 1999, Catherine Ott hosted a conference at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., titled Disability and the Practice of Public History. I spoke at that conference, and I remarked to my fellow presenters that if a large anvil were to drop on our lineup of 10 or 12 participants, it would wipe out disability studies in the United States. The field's rapid growth over the ensuing decade was assisted by the Modern Language Association, which published the book Disability Studies Enabling the Humanities in 2002, and also organized a conference hosted by Rosemary Garland Thompson at Emory University in 2004. By that point, the young field had invested most of its energies in developing the social model of disability and offering analyses of the representation of disability, very much like the early second wave feminist images of women analyses of the 1970s. Mitchell and Snyder were, in that context, the first scholars to go beyond that terrain and to try to develop a theory of how disability studies can change the way we read literary texts, quite apart from reading for representation. Let me be clear about this. Narrative prosthesis is still very much about representations of disability in literature and film, but it is only occasionally interested in arguing that bad representations have baleful effects on the lives of people with disabilities. It was and is more interested in showing how deployments of disability can work in literature and film, and in that sense, my own work on disability and narrative is basically a long footnote to that book. Among the things that felt like breakthroughs at the time, narrative prosthesis was perhaps the most important. But I mentioned the manifest limitations of early work in disability studies. Well, what did I mean by that? The field was exclusively white, demographically and with regard to subject matter, and almost entirely given over to the analysis of physical disability. The whiteness of the field, called out quickly by the late scholar Christopher Bell, rendered much of disability studies irrelevant to a great deal of new work in the humanities. In his essay, Introducing White Disability Studies, A Modest Proposal, that Bell launched that critique of the demographics of the field. And the overwhelming focus on physical disability resulted in an over-reliance on the social model of disability and a reluctance to acknowledge that greater accessibility in the built environment was more readily achieved with regard to physical disability than with regard to intellectual disability or mental health. Let me dwell on that second limitation for a moment, because the social model of disability was foundational for disability studies, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom, where it originated. According to the social model, disability is not a feature of individual bodies that are in need of repair. It is a social phenomenon. The medical model of disability, by contrast, does regard disability as a feature of individual bodies and as something to be remediated or fixed. But in the social model, individual bodily conditions are considered impairments, not disabilities, like deafness or paraplegia. But these conditions only become disabling when they are not accommodated by an accessible built environment. For example, deafness is not a disability if you're watching TV and there's closed captioning. Wheelchair users can be readily accommodated by curb cuts, kneeling buses, and widened doorways. This was the logic behind the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And it is no coincidence that as buildings and cities became more accessible, somewhat more accessible, in the wake of the ADA, many non-disabled people began to see that people with mobility impairments had long been disabled by their social environments rather than by their bodies. The social model of disability is still important for disability studies, but its limitations have become apparent. To be clear, the social model is not irrelevant for people with intellectual disabilities. My son, like millions of Americans with intellectual disabilities, benefited from the policy of inclusion instituted by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1975. That law, IDEA, allowed Jamie to attend school with his non-disabled peers. People with Down syndrome and other intellectual disabilities had far greater opportunities for intellectual growth and flourishing when we stopped warehousing them in hellish mental institutions and began treating them like full citizens. People with autism are finding greater acceptance and appreciation for the qualities their neurodivergence can bring to a classroom or workplace. But accommodations for people with intellectual disabilities or mental health issues is not as simple as curb cuts and kneeling buses. Some mental health conditions, for example, can only be mitigated by medication, which is obviously a concession to the medical model, and a concession to the idea that some disabilities should be remediated or fixed to the greatest extent possible. So, one development over the past 25 years has been the development of a much more nuanced account of disability, which takes into account phenomena like psychiatric disorders and chronic pain. And in the past few years, I've given a couple of interviews about the history of disability studies, in which I've said a couple of obvious things. That over the past 10 to 15 years, we've seen much more work on intersectionality, that is, the phenomenon of overlapping identities with regard to race, gender, and sexuality, as well as disability. Much greater efforts to understand disability globally, rather than just the United States, the UK, and the West. And much more emphasis on psychosocial, imperceptible, and intermittent disabilities. The people I usually cite are scholars like Margaret Price, Dennis Tyler, Ellen Samuels, Sami Schalk, M. Remy Yurgo, Terry Pickens, Nirmala Aravelis, Lamar Jarrell Bruce, Robert McClure, and Jasbir Puar. I'll just mention their books briefly here. Margaret Price's book Mad at School, Rhetorics of Mental Disability in Academic Life, was published in 2011, and it helped to introduce the term psychosocial disability, even though Price herself acknowledged that the term mental disability was more widely recognized. M. Remy Yurgo's book Authoring Autism on Rhetoric and Neurological Queerness was published in 2018 and offered a theory of rhetoric that performed neurodivergence. You could say that Yurgo attempted to write an autistic book. Nirmala Aravelis' Disability and Difference in Global Contexts, Enabling a Transformative Body Politic was published in 2011. And Robert McClure's Crip Times, Disability, Globalization, and Resistance appeared in 2018. The new work on disability and blackness has been astonishing. Sami Schalk's book Body Minds Reimagined, Disability, Race, and Gender in Black Women's Speculative Fiction was published in 2018 and opened up an entirely new direction for disability studies, which had hitherto been reluctant to discuss extravagantly unrealistic depictions of disability, such as those found in science fiction. Schalk's second book, Black Disability Politics, together with Dennis Tyler's Disabilities of the Color Line, Redressing Anti-Blackness from Slavery to the Present, were both published in 2022, and they have offered a profound rethinking of the relationship between Black liberation movements and the history of disability in the United States. Terry Pickens' book, Black Madness, Mad Blackness, 2019, and Lamar Jarrell Bruce's How to Go Mad Without Losing Your Mind, Madness and Black Radical Creativity, published in 2021. These books explore the relationship between Black liberation and psychosocial disability, reaching deep into disability history with the reclamation of the term MAD. And finally, Jasbir Puar's The Right to Maim, Debility, Capacity, Disability, published in 2017, is a sometimes unfair critique of disability pride, which is not so simply celebratory as Puar suggests. Rather, it has to do with the social destigmatization of disability, analogous to the destigmatization of homosexuality. But Puar's book is important for its emphasis on deliberately inflicted disability, as in torture and war, a phenomenon that Puar rightly claims had been overlooked in the first 2 decades of disability studies. Now I'll return briefly to the year 2000, and to Mitchell and Snyder's book, Narrative Prosthesis, a landmark in literary disability studies. In that book, Mitchell and Snyder offer a sweeping account of narrative as such. Quote, disability inaugurates narrative, but narrative inevitably punishes its own prurient interests by overseeing the extermination of the object of its fascination. Close quote. Now, I'm struck, and I have been for 25 years, by the word prurient, which suggests that narrative has some nasty sexual desire for disability. But in The Secret Life of Stories, my own book published in 2016, I critiqued this passage for what is ultimately the more objectionable word, inevitably. And I paired it with a similar passage in Mitchell and Snyder that appeared a few pages earlier in their book. Quote, all narratives operate out of a desire to compensate for a limitation or to rein in excess. Well, close quote. I have very little tolerance for formulations like all narrative does X, and I said as much in The Secret Life of Stories. So I won't go over that argument here. I tried to tread carefully in my discussion of Mitchell and Snyder in Secret Life in my own book. Not out of any sentimental reluctance to criticize colleagues I value, but because their book, Narrative Prosthesis, loomed over me so imposingly. Its influence, I worried, might induce me to heighten and exaggerate my criticisms of it. So here, I'd like to take a different tack. I suggest that narrative prosthesis has had such staying power and has had so great an impact on literary disability studies, precisely because its central claims are so sweeping. In this respect, it shares something important with a very different book out of the Marxist tradition, Fredric Jameson's The Political Unconscious, published in 1981. Namely, in both books, the overarching project, the framework, is ultimately more important than the question of whether any of the readings of specific literary texts are convincing. And the project of narrative prosthesis, as I described it in The Secret Life of Stories, is twofold. One, to show how narrative effaces or eliminates disability, inevitably no less, every time. And then two, to show how disability resists its effacement and lays bare the literary device that would seek to remove disability from view. If this sounds contradictory, it is. But let's go to the text of Narrative Prosthesis to see what it's doing. In Chapter 2, Narrative Prosthesis and the Materiality of Metaphor, Mitchell and Snyder write, this is a long quote, a simple schematic of narrative structure might run thus. First, a deviance or marked difference is exposed to a reader. Second, a narrative consolidates the need for its own existence by calling for an explanation of the deviation's origins and formative consequences. Third, the deviance is brought from the periphery of concerns to the center of the story to come. And fourth, the remainder of the story rehabilitates or fixes the deviance in some manner. Okay, long quote. This is, I think, an accurate account of many, but not all, deployments of disability in literature and film. It is practically a template for any number of Disney films, for example. And over the past 25 years, most of the articles I've read in the field take this approach, citing narrative prosthesis and proceeding to demonstrate that the text under discussion does indeed follow this narrative structure. But the second half of their project goes in the opposite direction. In their introduction, Disability as Narrative Supplement, Mitchell and Snyder argue that narrative prosthesis does not efface or eliminate disability, but rather inevitably fails to do so. Quote, narrative prosthesis is first and foremost about the ways in which the ruse of prosthesis fails in its primary objective, to return the incomplete body to the invisible status of a normative essence. The works under scrutiny here tend to leave the wound of disability undressed, so to speak. Its presence is enunciated as transgressive, in that literary works often leave the disabled body as a troubled and troubling position within culture. Close quote. Now that, it seems to me, is a bit of trouble in narrative prosthesis, the way it provocatively insists on the disabled body. The book has very little to say about intellectual disability, but it provocatively insists that the disabled body is a troubled and troubling position within culture. That is what makes the project worth the time and the trouble for me, and I think that's one of the reasons it has been so influential. If the literary work effaces or eliminates disability, then you've got narrative prosthesis. But since narrative prosthesis fails in its primary objective, you've still got narrative prosthesis. To put this another way, This theory covers a lot of ground in both directions. Even more ambitious are the manifesto-like claims that disability supersedes all other forms of embodiment, as in the suggestion that, quote, one might think of disability as the master trope of human disqualification, close quote. Also, they claim that disability is the foundation of literary character and plot. Quote, it is the narrative of disability's very unknowability that consolidates the need to tell a story about it. Thus, in stories about characters with disabilities, an underlying issue is always whether their disability is the foundation of character itself. The question is not whether disability is cause or a symptom of or distraction from a disturbing behavioral trait, but whether its mystery can be pierced by the storyteller. Indeed, the very next sentence throws down the gauntlet in a way that is truly stunning. Quote, disability inaugurates the act of interpretation. I think there is no point quibbling with that claim. There's no point in my saying, well, actually, lots of things inaugurate the act of interpretation, including the question of why my city is cursed with this plague, and the question of who is this stranger who just appeared in town. But it would be like saying, responding to Mitchell and Snyder's claim about disability and interpretation, it would be like saying not all of the history of previous societies has been the history of class struggle, or something like the 20th century had problems other than the problem of the color line. Now, of course, here I'm referring to, in the first place, Karl Marx, and in the second place, W.E.B. Du Bois. Marx claimed that all of history was class struggle. Du Bois said the history of the 20th century would be the history of the color, the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. To take issue with the empirical accuracy of such utterances, I think, is to miss the point. What makes these claims manifesto-like is their ability to reorient the field of vision entirely, to compel us to imagine what would the world look like if I started trying to see it in this way. And thereby, of course, to imagine that another world is possible. And so, even though the field today in disability studies is refreshingly unrecognizable to the field as it existed in 2000, Mitchell and Snyder's breakthrough book really was a breakthrough, and its influence has endured. I think there are really only two other books that attempt to bring literary theory to disability studies, and vice versa. Aside from my own A Secret Life of Stories, I would point to Otto Quayson's 2008 book, Aesthetic Nervousness, Disability and the Crisis of Representation. Mitchell and Snyder's book has been more influential than either of these. I'd now like to close with a brief discussion of two more aspects of contemporary disability studies. One involves a new willingness to acknowledge pain and chronic fatigue. I would point to the late Christina Crosby's 2016 book, A Body Undone, Living On After Great Pain, which is an account of Crosby's life after a severe cycling accident, which nearly takes her life. And then more recently, Jonathan Stern's remarkable combination of phenomenology and personal narrative in his book, Diminished Faculties, A Political Phenomenology of Impairment, published in 2022, which offers a brilliant account of his thyroid cancer and paralyzed vocal cord, which is a brutal irony for the scholar who founded the field of sound studies in the 1990s, together with an account of fatigue and disability accommodations in academia, hence the pun of the title, Diminished Faculties. The other aspect of contemporary disability studies involves analyses of accessibility in built environments, ranging from buildings and city spaces to kitchen utensils to industrial design, assistive technology, emergency warning systems, and environmental pollution. Here, I would cite Bess Williamson's Accessible America, A History of Disability and Design, published in 2019, as well as Amy Hamrai's 2017 book, Building Access, University Design and the Politics of Disability. Sarah Hendren, a professor in the College of Arts, Media and Design at Northeastern University in Boston, published What Can a Body Do? How We Meet the Built World in 2020. Her colleague at Northeastern University, Meryl Alper, published Giving Voice, Mobile Communication, Disability and Inequality in 2017. Closely related to Alper's work is Elizabeth Elsessor's first book, Restricted Access, Media, Disability, and the Politics of Participation, published in 2016. Elsessor's second book, on emergency warning systems, was published in 2022 and is titled In Case of Emergency, How Technologies Mediate Crisis and Normalize Inequality. And finally, on environmental pollution, I would recommend Sonora Taylor's recently published book, just came out this year, Disabled Ecologies, Lessons from a Wounded Desert. I hope this brief overview will suffice as an account of the evolution of American disability studies over the past 25 years. We are now at a point, I believe, where disability studies is a well-established field and has strong interdisciplinary connections, not only to other fields in the humanities, but also to disciplines in art and design, architectural engineering, and science and technology. On that note, I'd like to stop here and proceed to the questions that have been sent to me, the first of which asks about disability studies and interdisciplinarity. Question 1. Your academic career spans multiple fields, including literary studies and disability studies. In light of today's in light of today's academic specialization and the trend toward interdisciplinary collaboration, how do you view the role of disability studies as a discipline in fostering interdisciplinary cooperation? Great question. Disability studies touches on nearly every aspect of being human. And as I mentioned in my talk, the field has begun to branch out into analyses of the built environment and various forms of technology. The field simply has to be interdisciplinary, drawing on the arts, humanities, and social sciences. In fact, its first institutional home at Penn State was in the Science, Technology, and Society program, which was very unfortunately eliminated in 2011. We had created a disability studies minor. My wife had done that in 2006. And it is now housed in English, but its first home was in Science, Technology, and Society. Now, I tend to be skeptical of many claims about interdisciplinarity. When I was the director of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities at Penn State, I used to say that everyone who applied for funding claimed to be interdisciplinary, even if they were just writing about literature and film. One of my colleagues even claimed that an edition of a famous writer's letters was an interdisciplinary project, presumably on the grounds that the letters addressed a wide variety of subjects. That's not interdisciplinarity, I said. I want to see serious interdisciplinarity, like a project that combines theater and metallurgy. I was kidding, but we actually did hire 2 postdoctoral scholars whose work was almost like that. One worked on the history of recording nature sounds, which also is about the history of recording outdoors and the history of avant-garde music. The other worked on the history of plastic, which spanned fields from art and design to chemical engineering. Disability studies offers that kind of interdisciplinarity. the real thing. Question 2. Disability studies has developed over several decades as an academic field. What emerging areas or underexplored topics do you think might become major focuses of research in the coming years? Well, excuse me, I honestly have no ability to predict the future. So I'll answer by turning to the recent past and the kind of material I talked about at the end of my lecture. And I'll hazard a guess that we'll see more work on globalization, intersectionality, psychosocial, imperceptible and intermittent disabilities, pain and fatigue, deliberately inflicted disability, environmental damage and disability and technology. That's a lot. I think it's a pretty safe bet we'll see more work in those directions. Question 3. How do you envision potential collaboration between children's literature studies and disability studies in the future? I don't have a good answer for this one because I don't know much about children's literature. I will remark, though, that 2 of my key examples in The Secret Life of Stories were drawn from young adult literature, Madeleine L'Engle's book A Wrinkle in Time, and the last in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. So I think people in young adult and children's literature have been drawing on disability for quite some time. Question 4. Do you believe that in future artistic creations, disabled characters might fully break away from their symbolic roles and become genuine narrative agents with true subjectivity? Well, I believe they already have, and the examples are literally too numerous to name. I think that about the symbolic roles, disability is often used to represent something else in literary works. And I think that Mitchell and Snyder are right to suggest that sometimes it serves as the very basis for literary character. But as James Berger pointed out many years ago, even in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, where Ahab is defined by his disability and the monomania that consumes him as a result, that leads him to seek revenge against the white whale, there is another disabled ship captain in that novel, Captain Boomer. And his disability, he has lost an arm, doesn't seem to mean anything at all. He's just a ship captain who's lost an arm. Many disabled characters are like that. They're just plain disabled characters with true subjectivity, not playing symbolic roles in any way. Question 5. In your book, you mention that understanding disability representation can change the way we read. Could you elaborate on how this transformation occurs? I would love to. Thank you for all these great questions. For one thing, the first thing, we start seeing forms of disability everywhere, even in non-realistic genres, like science fiction or comic books. The Disney and Marvel Comics franchises have been getting more and more explicit in recent years about how their characters can be understood in terms of disability representation, even when they have superpowers. That has always been the premise of the mutants known as the X-Men. They have superpowers, but they're also people with disabilities. But beyond that, I want to return to what I think is the main argument of The Secret Life of Stories. So I'll end awkwardly by quoting that book, because the question asked about disability representation. And I think this is an important argument to end on. Disability in the relationship between a text and a reader need not involve any characters with disabilities at all. It can involve ideas about disability and ideas about the stigma associated with disability, regardless of whether any one specific character or characters can be pegged with a specific diagnosis. And again, that's where I drew from Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time. No character in that book has a disability, but everyone thinks, outside the Murray family, everyone thinks their youngest child is intellectually disabled, and they call him a moron. He's in fact preternaturally advanced child who can also read minds and understands general relativity, though he hasn't yet learned how to read at the age of 5. But he's not disabled. You don't have to have a character with disabilities. The book can still, a literary text can still deal with ideas about disability. Or literary texts can try narrative strategies about disability that don't have to do with representation. My example from young adult literature from Harry Potter was Dumbledore's sister, Ariana, who was disabled as a result of a Muggle attack. And that we never meet her, she's never represented, but we are given to understand that that was the most important thing in Dumbledore's life. She is the motive for why his career takes the trajectory it does. So that's using disability as motive for a narrative, not in terms of representation. I think this opens the field of criticism considerably. And I think this is a good thing, because I don't think, as I said in the book, I'm determined to cure disability studies of its habit of diagnosing fictional characters. I was kidding about that. I'm not trying to cure anything. But I do think there are lots of ways to read about disability in literature without reading for disability representation. And I also think that the range of disability representations we can read is much larger than most people think, and that it extends even to non-realistic genres. I hope people find that useful, and I hope they find it generative, and I hope they find it fun, because disability can take so many forms. Literature can take so many forms. It's a pretty rich field, and I hope it continues to grow. Thank you. Thank you for your time and your attention.